In the grand theatre of human history, few moments rival the sheer audacity of what unfolded in Moscow on August 23, 1939. Picture, if you will, two mortal enemies, ideologies so fundamentally opposed that their very existence seemed to depend on the other's destruction, suddenly clasping hands in the shadows of the Kremlin. It was a betrayal so profound, so utterly unexpected, that it would reshape the very foundations of our world. Before we continue this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. The ornate halls of the Kremlin had witnessed countless diplomatic ceremonies, but nothing quite like this. Outside, Moscow's summer evening cast long shadows across Red Square, while inside, the fate of millions was being decided with the flourish of a pen. Nazi Germany's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, had arrived in the Soviet capital carrying with him the most unlikely proposition in modern diplomacy. Here was a man representing the Third Reich, a regime that had built its very identity on the destruction of Bolshevism, preparing to shake hands with Joseph Stalin himself. Consider for a moment the sheer impossibility of this scene. For 6 years, Nazi propaganda had painted communists as humanity's greatest threat. Soviet newspapers had reciprocated, denouncing fascism as capitalism's violent death throes. Their followers had fought bloody street battles across Europe. Their ideologies were as incompatible as fire and ice. Yet here they were, about to sign what would appear to the world as a simple non-aggression pact. But appearances, as we shall discover, can be devastatingly deceptive. The document that emerged from these negotiations bore the innocuous title of the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. To diplomats across Europe scanning the published text, it seemed almost mundane. Two nations agreeing not to attack each other, to remain neutral should either become involved in war with a third party. The British Foreign Office noted it with concern but not alarm. The French saw it as an unfortunate but manageable development. The Americans, still wrapped in isolationist slumber, barely registered its significance. What none of them knew, what the world would not discover for decades, was that this public treaty was merely the visible tip of an iceberg whose hidden mass would sink entire nations. In the private chambers of the Kremlin, as champagne flowed and cameras captured smiling faces for posterity, Ribbentrop and his Soviet counterpart, Vyacheslav Molotov, were putting the finishing touches on a second document. This one would never see the light of day, would never be announced in press releases or debated in parliaments. This was the secret protocol Article 2 of the Devil's Bargain that would change everything. Imagine watching these men as they bent over a map of Eastern Europe, their fingers tracing lines across territories where millions of people lived their daily lives, utterly unaware that their futures were being carved up like portions of a feast. The precision was chilling in its clinical detachment. The secret protocol divided these lands into what it euphemistically called spheres of influence, but what it really created were hunting grounds for two predators who had decided that cooperation would serve them better than competition. Poland, that ancient nation which had fought for centuries to maintain its independence between Germanic and Russian expansion, found itself at the very center of this cartographic surgery. The secret line drawn by Hitler and Stalin ran roughly along the Narev, Vistula, and San rivers, a boundary that would slice through Polish villages, separate families, and doom a proud nation to disappearance from the map of Europe. But the conspirators' appetites extended far beyond Poland. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the entire eastern Baltic shore was parcelled out between the two dictators with the casual efficiency of estate agents dividing property. Romania's eastern provinces were assigned to Stalin's sphere. The map of Europe was being redrawn in a Moscow drawing room, and not a single representative of the affected nations was present to witness their fate being sealed. The biological world offers us many examples of unlikely partnerships, the crocodile and the plover bird, the shark and the remora fish. But these are relationships of mutual benefit forged by millions of years of evolution. What we witnessed in Moscow was something far more calculated and infinitely more sinister. a temporary alliance of convenience between apex predators who had recognized that they could feast more efficiently by dividing their prey than by fighting each other for it. Stalin understood the mathematics of this arrangement with crystalline clarity. Germany's western borders were defended by the mighty Siegfried Line. Its armies were the most technologically advanced in the world, and its industrial capacity was reaching terrifying heights. A war between Nazi Germany and the Western democracies was not just possible, it was inevitable. By signing this pact, Stalin ensured that when that war came, Germany would be fighting on only one front, while he had a free hand to settle old scores in the east. For Hitler, the calculation was equally compelling. His generals had warned him repeatedly about the nightmare of a two-front war, the very trap that had strangled Germany in the previous world conflict. With Stalin's neutrality secured, he could unleash the full fury of the Wehrmacht against Poland, France, and Britain, without fear of Siberian divisions appearing on his eastern borders. The secret protocol contained one additional clause that would prove prophetic in its cynicism. Both parties agreed that whether Polish independence could be maintained would be decided by further political developments. In plain language, they were agreeing that Poland's very right to exist would depend on how successfully they could divide and digest it. As the evening wore on and the documents were signed, sealed, and locked away in the Kremlin's most secure vaults, Stalin raised his glass in a toast that would have chilled the blood of every democratic leader in Europe had they been present to hear it. "I know how much the German nation loves its Führer," he declared. "I should therefore like to drink to his health." The irony was as bitter as it was complete. The man who had spent years purging his own nation of suspected Nazi sympathizers was now toasting Adolf Hitler's health. The Führer who had written in Mein Kampf about the need to destroy Bolshevism was now accepting Stalin's congratulations. Two of history's most murderous dictators had found common ground in their shared appetite for conquest. 8 days. That was all the time that remained between this secret signing and the moment when German artillery would begin its bombardment of Poland. 8 days for the world to continue spinning in blissful ignorance of what had been decided in its absence. 8 days for Polish families to enjoy their last peaceful meals, for children to play in gardens that would soon echo with the thunder of approaching armies, for a nation to draw its final breaths as a free and independent state. The secret protocol was more than a diplomatic document. It was a death warrant for the European order that had emerged from the ashes of the previous World War. The League of Nations, collective security, the hope that civilization had learned from its previous catastrophic mistakes. All of these ideals were about to be tested in the crucible of totalitarian ambition. What makes this moment so extraordinary in the long sweep of human history is not simply the scale of the betrayal, but its utter invisibility to those who would pay its price. In nature, predators rarely disguise their intentions so completely. A lion stalking across the savannah is visible to its prey. A hawk circling overhead announces its presence. But political predators operate differently. They smile and shake hands and sign public documents declaring their peaceful intentions while privately sharpening their claws. The world would wake on August 24th to news reports describing a surprising but manageable diplomatic development. Editorial writers would analyze the implications for European stability. Dinner party conversations would speculate about what it all meant. But none of them, not the wisest diplomat, not the most perceptive journalist, not the most suspicious intelligence analyst, could have imagined the true scope of what had been agreed in Moscow's shadowed chambers. Poland slept peacefully that night, unaware that it had already been sentenced to extinction. The secret that would stun the world was sealed away in the Kremlin's vaults, waiting for the thunder of approaching armies to reveal its terrible truth. But thunder, as we shall see, was already building on the horizon. The first rays of dawn on September 1st, 1939, brought with them the sound that would define a generation, the thunder of 1,500 aircraft darkening the Polish sky. At precisely 4:45 in the morning, German artillery erupted along Poland's western frontier in a symphony of destruction that announced the birth of a new kind of warfare. Imagine standing in those final moments of peace, perhaps in a small Polish village near the German border, watching the eastern horizon as it begins to glow not with sunrise, but with the flash of muzzle fire from hundreds of guns. The very air seems to vibrate with approaching doom. This is Blitzkrieg lightning war, and the world has never seen anything like it. The Wehrmacht revolutionary tactics unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of death. First came the Stukas, those distinctive dive bombers whose screaming sirens were designed as much to terrorize as to destroy. They fell from the sky like mechanical vultures, their precision strikes severing communication lines, destroying bridges, and shattering the nervous system of Polish defense. Behind them roared the Heinkel and Dornier bombers, turning Polish airfields into cratered wastelands before most Polish pilots could even reach their aircraft. But the true genius of Blitzkrieg lay not in any single weapon, but in their coordination. As Polish defenders struggled to comprehend the scale of the aerial assault, German tanks were already punching through their fortifications. These weren't the lumbering metal giants of the previous war. These panzers moved with the fluid grace of a pack hunt, supported by motorized infantry and self-propelled artillery that could keep pace with the armored spearheads. Consider the mathematics of this assault. Germany deployed 1.5 million troops against Poland's 900,000. But numbers alone don't tell the story. The Wehrmacht's advantage lay in concentration and speed. While Polish forces were spread thinly along extensive borders, German armies struck like focused lightning bolts at carefully chosen points, achieving overwhelming local superiority that shattered defensive lines before they could stabilize. The Polish response was everything that courage could make it, and yet tragically inadequate to the challenge they faced. Polish cavalry units, yes, cavalry in the age of mechanized warfare, charged German armor in acts of such impossible bravery that they transcended military futility to become something approaching the sacred. These were not the suicidal anachronisms that propaganda would later portray, but desperate attempts by highly trained horsemen to strike at vulnerable supply columns and disrupted infantry formations. Yet when horse met steel in the fields of Poland, the outcome was never in doubt. The speed of the German advance defied every expectation of modern warfare. Traditional military wisdom suggested that attacking armies needed numerical superiority of at least 3-1 to guarantee success. The Germans achieved something far more devastating. They created the illusion of being everywhere at once. Polish commanders found themselves fighting not one coordinated invasion, but what seemed like dozens of simultaneous breakthroughs that materialized faster than information could travel between headquarters. In the biological world, we sometimes witness what scientists call a predator swarm, when multiple hunting species coordinate their attacks to overwhelm prey that might otherwise escape any single predator. The German invasion of Poland resembled nothing so much as this natural phenomenon, scaled up to encompass an entire nation. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry moved in deadly harmony, each element supporting the others in a symphony of destruction that left Polish defenders reeling. But if the Western assault was lightning, what approached from the east 17 days later was something altogether different, a red tide that would drown the last hopes of Polish resistance. September 17th dawned grey and cold across eastern Poland. Polish forces, battered but not broken by the German onslaught, had managed a fighting withdrawal toward the southeastern regions of their country. Here, they hoped to establish new defensive lines, perhaps to hold out until the promised Western offensive relieved pressure on the German front. Polish commanders still believed they were fighting one enemy, still clung to the hope that geography and determination might yet save their nation. They had no idea that 600,000 Soviet troops were already crossing their eastern borders. The mathematical precision of this betrayal takes your breath away. For 16 days, Stalin had watched German forces grinding through Polish defences, calculating the perfect moment to strike. Too early, and he risked confronting Polish forces still capable of significant resistance. Too late, and German armies might occupy territory that the secret protocol had allocated to his sphere of influence. The timing had to be exact, and it was. At dawn on September 17th, Soviet forces crossed the Polish border on a front stretching from the Baltic to the Carpathian Mountains. The scale was staggering. 12 armies comprising 52 divisions, supported by hundreds of aircraft and thousands of tanks. But what made this assault particularly devastating was not its size, but its position. Polish forces had oriented their entire defensive strategy toward the German threat in the west. Their eastern borders were lightly defended, manned primarily by border guards and second-line troops, who found themselves facing one of the largest military operations in history. The tragedy unfolding across Poland was geometric in its inevitability. Imagine a nation as a circle under pressure. When force is applied from one direction, the circle can deform, bend, even partially collapse, while maintaining some structural integrity. But when equal pressure is applied from opposite directions simultaneously, the circle has nowhere to bend. It can only shatter. This was the impossible mathematics that Polish forces now faced. Every retreat from German pressure in the west drove them toward Soviet forces advancing from the east. Every defensive position established against Soviet assault left their rear exposed to German pursuit. Poland had become a closing vice, and its armies were caught between the jaws. The human cost was immediate and catastrophic. Polish units that had maintained discipline and cohesion through 2 weeks of German assault suddenly found themselves surrounded, cut off from retreat routes, facing enemies on all sides. The lucky ones were captured quickly. Others fought on in isolated pockets, burning through their ammunition in battles that could have only one outcome. Some simply dissolved as soldiers abandoned their units to search for their families in a homeland that was disappearing around them. Yet even in the face of mathematical certainty, individual acts of courage blazed like stars in the darkness. Polish pilots, their airfields destroyed and their squadrons scattered, flew suicide missions against German formations with aircraft held together by wire and prayer. Polish naval vessels, hopelessly outnumbered, sailed out to engage German warships in battles they could not win but would not avoid. Polish civilians took up hunting rifles and kitchen knives to resist tanks' gestures of defiance that were militarily meaningless but morally absolute. The siege of Warsaw became the symbol of this impossible courage. As German and Soviet forces carved up the countryside around them, the Polish capital held out for 27 days. The city's defenders included regular army units, police, and thousands of civilian volunteers who built barricades from overturned trams and fought from apartment buildings with weapons designed for different wars. German artillery pounded the city into rubble. German aircraft dropped incendiary bombs that turned entire districts into furnaces. Still, Warsaw held, but holding was not the same as hoping. By late September, even the most optimistic Polish commanders understood that they were witnessing not just a military defeat, but the death of their nation. The mathematics of two-front warfare had proved inexorable. No army in history could have withstood the coordinated assault that Poland faced, and yet the knowledge of inevitability did nothing to diminish the sting of abandonment by allies who had promised to help. On September 27th, Warsaw finally surrendered. The last major Polish forces capitulated in early October. In just 36 days, a nation that had existed for nearly 1,000 years had been erased from the map of Europe. The speed was unprecedented, the coordination between former enemies unprecedented, the scale of betrayal unprecedented. But perhaps most unprecedented of all was the silence that followed from the West. As German and Soviet forces shook hands at their new mutual border, dividing Polish prisoners and Polish territory with the business-like efficiency of partners in a successful enterprise, the echo of that silence would reverberate through history. Poland had fallen not just to superior force, but to superior calculation. The cold mathematics of realpolitik that could transform allies into observers and moral commitments into strategic considerations. The lightning war had met the red tide, and between them, they had drowned a nation while the world watched and weighed its options. September 3rd, 1939, 11:15 in the morning. In the Houses of Parliament, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain rises to address a nation holding its breath. His voice carries across the wireless waves to millions of British homes as he announces that Great Britain is now at war with Germany. 6 hours later, French Premier Édouard Daladier makes an identical declaration from Paris. The die is cast. The Western democracies have drawn their line in the sand and declared that German aggression will not stand. The moral clarity of that moment was crystalline, absolute, inspiring. Hitler's unprovoked assault on Poland had finally awakened the sleeping giant of democratic conscience. After years of appeasement, of hoping that reasonable men could find reasonable solutions to unreasonable demands, Britain and France had rediscovered their spine. The message rang clear across Europe. Territorial aggression by totalitarian powers would be met with the full force of democratic resistance. But clarity, as we are about to rediscover, is sometimes as fragile as morning mist. 14 days later, as Soviet tanks rolled across Poland's eastern frontier and Stalin's armies began their own campaign of conquest and occupation, something extraordinary happened in the capitals of Western democracy. Nothing. The same voices that had thundered with moral outrage against German aggression suddenly found themselves afflicted with a curious case of laryngitis. The same newspapers that had dedicated front pages to condemning Hitler's violation of international law relegated Soviet actions to inside stories with carefully neutral headlines. Consider the ecosystem of international law as it existed in September 1939. Like any natural system, it operated according to observable patterns and predictable relationships. Unprovoked aggression was supposed to trigger automatic responses from the community of nations. Treaty obligations created binding commitments that transcended narrow self-interest. The League of Nations, however weakened, still represented humanity's attempt to create a world where might did not automatically make right. Yet when Soviet forces crossed into Poland, this entire ecosystem suddenly revealed hidden rules that no one had written down but everyone seemed to understand. Some invasions, apparently, were more equal than others. Some aggressions demanded immediate response, while others merited careful consideration of complex circumstances. The moral universe that had seemed so clear on September 3rd developed subtle shades of grey by September 17th. The transformation was not gradual. It was instantaneous and complete. British Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, who had spent sleepless nights drafting ultimatums to Germany, now found himself explaining to Parliament why Soviet actions were different in character from German aggression. French Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet, who had proclaimed France's unshakable commitment to Polish independence, discovered nuanced interpretations of treaty obligations that somehow exempted Eastern invasions from Western responses. But perhaps the most stunning voice in this chorus of selective outrage belonged to Winston Churchill himself, the man who would later embody Britain's moral resistance to totalitarianism, who would speak of fighting on the beaches and never surrendering, stood before the British people in September 1939 and declared Soviet aggression against Poland to be clearly necessary for Russian safety. Imagine the cognitive mathematics required to maintain such positions. The same tanks crossing the same borders in violation of the same international laws somehow acquired different moral properties, depending on the flags they flew. Polish sovereignty apparently existed in a quantum state simultaneously absolute when threatened from the West, and negotiable when challenged from the East. The principle of collective security revealed itself to be less a universal law than a selective application dependent on strategic convenience. The British government's private calculations were breathtaking in their cold precision. Cabinet minutes from late September, declassified decades later, reveal discussions that read like strategic game theory rather than moral philosophy. Ministers debated whether confronting both Germany and the Soviet Union simultaneously would serve British interests. They calculated the probability that Stalin might eventually turn against Hitler if properly courted. They weighed the mathematical likelihood that a three-front war would exceed Britain's capacity to wage it successfully. Nowhere in these documents do we find anguished debates about abandoning Poland to its fate. Nowhere do we see ministers wrestling with the moral implications of applying different standards to identical aggression. The transformation from moral absolutism to strategic relativism appears to have occurred without visible internal struggle, as if the principles proclaimed so passionately on September 3rd had been written in disappearing ink. France's position was, if anything, even more calculated. French military planners had always understood that defending Poland would require a massive offensive against Germany's western fortifications, an offensive that would cost hundreds of thousands of French lives and might well fail, regardless of its moral justification. The Soviet invasion provided what strategists call elegant exit, a face-saving reason to avoid an unwanted obligation. If Poland was being attacked from both directions, French generals reasoned, then surely French intervention would be both futile and wasteful. The elegant mathematics of this reasoning ignored one inconvenient fact. The Soviet assault had been coordinated with German forces through the secret protocol that Western intelligence agencies suspected but could not prove. Poland was not facing two separate invasions that happened. To coincide, it was confronting a carefully orchestrated pincer movement designed to ensure that resistance would be impossible and rescue unlikely. Yet even this knowledge might not have changed Western calculations. The ecosystem of international relations operates according to its own version of natural selection, where survival often trumps principle and adaptation matters more than consistency. Britain and France were democratic nations whose leaders answered to populations that had no appetite for another catastrophic war. The moral clarity that demanded confronting German aggression did not extend to embracing military suicide in Poland's defense. The silence that followed Soviet aggression was not empty. It was full of calculation, pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of choices that leaders hoped they would never have to explain to history. British and French diplomats began what they privately called the long game, maintaining enough moral flexibility to eventually align with Stalin against Hitler should circumstances make such an alliance necessary. This strategic thinking was not without precedent. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had repeatedly allied with autocratic Russia against Republican France when British interests demanded it. In the Great War, democratic Britain and France had welcomed Tsarist Russia as an ally against Imperial Germany, despite the Tsar's domestic brutality. The principle was simple. In existential conflicts, ideological preferences yield to survival necessities. But the human cost of such calculations was immediate and devastating. Polish forces fighting desperately against German assault kept requesting information about the promised Western offensive that would relieve pressure on their front. Polish diplomats in London and Paris sent increasingly desperate cables asking when their allies would honor their treaty obligations. Polish civilians fleeing Soviet occupation looked westward for rescue that would never come. The responses grew shorter and vaguer as September progressed. Military considerations require careful coordination. Weather conditions may affect operational timing. Complex strategic factors must be evaluated. Eventually, the responses stopped coming altogether. Yet perhaps the most revealing moment came not in what Western leaders said publicly, but in what they said to each other privately. In a closed session of the British cabinet on September 19th, just 2 days after Soviet invasion began, Lord Halifax summarized the government's position with chilling precision. We are not strong enough to wage war against Germany and Russia simultaneously. We must choose our enemies carefully and our friends pragmatically. The mathematical logic was unassailable. The moral logic was devastating. The ecosystem of international law revealed its hidden operating system. Principles apply when they serve power, yield when they threaten it, and disappear entirely when survival is at stake. The great silence that followed Soviet aggression was more than diplomatic calculation. It was a revelation of how moral ecosystems adapt under pressure. Like any natural system facing existential threat, the Western alliance prioritized survival over consistency, flexibility over principle, strategic advantage over moral clarity. This silence would echo through the decades to come, shaping Cold War calculations, influencing decolonization struggles, and establishing precedents for how democratic nations would balance moral commitments against strategic necessities. The pattern established in September 1939 that some aggression matters more than others, that some victims deserve rescue, while others merit abandonment would repeat itself across continents and generations. The Great Silence was not an aberration in the ecosystem of international relations. It was a feature, not a bug, a natural adaptation that allowed democratic societies to survive in a world where moral absolutes could be luxury items that smaller nations paid for with their independence. But for Poland, caught between the lightning and the tide, the silence was simply the sound of abandonment echoing across a continent that had promised to care. In the grand machinery of international politics, individual human voices often disappear beneath the grinding of strategic calculations and diplomatic necessity. But sometimes, if we listen carefully enough, we can hear them crying out across the static of history, bearing witness to moments when the personal collides with the political in ways that illuminate the true cost of great power decisions. September 21st, 1939. In a cramped radio station, somewhere in what remains of Free Poland, General Tadeusz Kutreba adjusts his headphones and speaks into a microphone that connects him to his British liaison officers, hundreds of miles away. His voice carries the exhaustion of a man who has been fighting impossible odds for 3 weeks, but also the desperate hope of someone who still believes that promises mean something. "Where is the promised Western offensive?" he asks, his words crackling across the static. "Our forces have held longer than anyone thought possible. We have tied down 40 German divisions that could otherwise be used against France. When do you begin your attack?" The response, when it comes, is a masterpiece of diplomatic evasion. Weather conditions are unfavorable. Supply lines need consolidation. Strategic coordination requires careful timing. The subtext is clear to anyone willing to hear it. No Western offensive is coming. No rescue is planned. Poland is alone. But Kutreba continues transmitting, night after night, sending situation reports that become increasingly desperate and increasingly pointless. He describes Polish units down to their last ammunition, civilian, populations fleeing in every direction, Soviet forces linking up with German units as if they had been rehearsing this dance for months. His reports read like messages in bottles thrown into an ocean of indifference. Meanwhile, in the elegant offices of Whitehall, Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax sorts through cables from Moscow with the methodical precision of a man solving an intricate puzzle. Stalin's diplomatic communications have taken on an almost surreal quality. The Soviet dictator apparently believes that Western leaders will accept his explanation that Red Army forces are merely protecting ethnic minorities in eastern Poland from the chaos of war. The mathematical audacity of this justification takes your breath away. Stalin's forces are conducting a full-scale military invasion involving 600,000 troops, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of tanks, but they are framing it as a humanitarian intervention. It's rather like describing a forest fire as a controlled burn or a hurricane as a weather adjustment. Yet Halifax finds himself under pressure from his own Prime Minister to find some way to make this fiction diplomatically acceptable. Consider the psychological contortions required to navigate such cognitive dissonance. Halifax must simultaneously maintain Britain's moral authority as Poland's defender, while creating space for eventual cooperation with Poland's destroyer. He must preserve the principle of collective security while demonstrating its selective application. He must speak of British honour while calculating British interests. His private diary entries from this period, released decades later, reveal a man wrestling with contradictions that would challenge any moral philosopher. "We have committed ourselves to defend Polish independence," he writes, "but we have not committed ourselves to Polish suicide, nor to our own." The distinction is subtle but crucial. Britain pledged to restore Polish independence after the war, not to prevent its temporary elimination during the war. This semantic precision allows Halifax to thread an impossible needle. When Polish ambassador Edward Radziński visits his office with increasingly frantic requests for military action against Soviet forces, Halifax can respond with genuine sympathy, while explaining the mathematical impossibility of fighting both Germany and Russia simultaneously. The conversation is conducted in the language of regret rather than refusal, maintaining the fiction that Britain wants to help while explaining why it cannot. But perhaps the most revealing voice in this chorus of moral complexity belongs to Winston Churchill. Still outside Chamberlain's government, but speaking as one of Britain's most influential public figures, Churchill delivers a radio address on October 1st that crystallises the Western position with remarkable clarity. Russia has pursued a cold policy of self-interest, he declares to millions of listeners across the British Empire. We could have wished that Russian armies should be standing on their present line as friends and allies of Poland instead of as invaders, but that the Russian armies should stand on this line was clearly necessary for the safety of Russia against the Nazi menace. The logical architecture of Churchill's argument is breathtaking in its sophistication. He acknowledges Soviet aggression while simultaneously justifying it. He expresses sympathy for Poland while explaining why Poland's sacrifice serves the greater good. He maintains Britain's moral authority while providing intellectual cover for abandoning Britain's moral obligations. The human cost of such intellectual gymnastics becomes visible in the French liaison offices scattered across what remains of free Poland. French officers, who have spent years building relationships with their Polish counterparts, now find themselves in the impossible position of explaining why their government's promises have evaporated. Major Jean-Paul Paluski, attached to Polish headquarters, later described these conversations as the most difficult of my military career. "How do you tell brave men that their bravery no longer matters?" he wrote in his memoirs. "How do you explain to allies that alliance has limitations they were never told about? How do you maintain personal honor while representing national dishonor?" Palevsky and his colleagues found themselves caught between professional duty and personal conscience. Their orders were clear: maintain liaison relationships while avoiding any commitments that might imply French military intervention. But their Polish counterparts were equally clear in their expectations. Liaison officers existed to coordinate the relief operations that must surely be coming. The gap between these realities created what psychologists might recognize as cognitive dissonance on a national scale. French officers reported conversations where Polish commanders would ask direct questions about French attack plans, only to receive responses that became increasingly abstract and philosophical. "We must consider the broader strategic picture," became the standard deflection. Premature action could compromise long-term objectives. But the most heartbreaking voices in this whirlwind belong to Polish civilians caught between the closing jaws of the German-Soviet vice. Maria Polikowska, a teacher from Lwów, kept a diary during the final weeks of Polish independence that was discovered decades later in a hidden archive. Her entries chronicle the gradual realization that the world they had known was disappearing forever. September 18th, she writes, "Radio reports speak of Soviet forces entering from the east. We had hoped they were coming as allies to help us fight the Germans, but the look on people's faces tells a different story. Someone understands something that hasn't been explained to the rest of us." September 22nd. The illusions are gone now. Soviet and German forces are not fighting each other. They are dividing our country between them like two neighbors sharing a garden they have decided to purchase together. No one asked us if we wanted to sell. September 28th. Warsaw still holds, but for what? Every day we listen to the radio hoping to hear that British and French armies are advancing from the west. Every day we hear explanations instead of action, words instead of deeds. I begin to understand that promises and principles are different things, and that we have been given one while needing the other. Her final entry, dated October 6th, carries the resignation of someone who has witnessed the gap between stated ideals and actual behavior. The professors speak of international law as if it were mathematics universal, predictable, binding, but law, like mathematics, apparently operates differently in different contexts. What applies to German aggression does not apply to Soviet aggression. What matters in Western calculations does not matter in Eastern realities. We are learning that the world is larger and smaller than we thought, larger in its capacity for moral flexibility, smaller in its willingness to pay prices for principles. These individual voices, military officers grappling with impossible orders, diplomats navigating between truth and necessity, civilians watching their world dissolve, illuminate something that grand strategic analysis often misses. Political decisions that appear rational and necessary at the level of national interest create human consequences that are deeply personal and often devastating. The whirlwind that swept across Europe in September 1939 was not just a clash of armies or ideologies. It was a test of whether individual conscience could survive contact with strategic necessity, whether personal relationships could withstand political calculations, whether human promises meant anything when weighed against mathematical realities. The voices that cry out from this historical storm remind us that every strategic decision is simultaneously thousands of personal tragedies. Every diplomatic calculation is also a human abandonment. Every national survival choice is someone else's existential crisis. In the grand ecosystem of international relations, these voices might seem like mere background noise, individual organisms caught in forces too large for personal influence. But they are also something more. Witnesses to the moment when moral systems reveal their true operating principles, testifying to the gap between what nations say they believe and what they actually do when survival is at stake. The whirlwind passes, the voices fade, but their testimony remains, echoing across the decades to remind us that behind every strategic calculation lies a human cost that someone, somewhere, must pay. In the natural world, great earthquakes do not simply occur and disappear, they send shock waves rippling outward, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations. The geological upheaval that shattered Poland in September 1939 would prove to be just such a seismic event, its aftershocks reverberating across decades and continents, shaping the lives of millions who had not yet been born when the first Soviet tanks crossed into eastern Poland. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in how power systems adapt to their own contradictions. By October 1939, Poland had ceased to exist as a sovereign state, yet Polish government officials somehow materialized in London's elegant embassy district, establishing what they called a government in exile. The mathematical impossibility of governing a country that no longer existed did not deter these determined men from maintaining the fiction that Poland's legal existence transcended its physical occupation. This was more than diplomatic theatre. It was a glimpse into how political ecosystems can evolve under pressure. The Polish government in exile would operate from London for the next 45 years, maintaining embassies, issuing passports, and conducting international relations for a nation that existed primarily in the realm of legal abstraction. They became political ghosts, representing the memory of a country while the territory itself was carved up between two totalitarian empires. But the most profound aftershock was not institutional, it was psychological. The pattern, established in September 1939, became a template that would repeat itself with mathematical precision across the decades to come. The lesson was simple and devastating. When great powers choose to abandon small ones, they will always find sophisticated justifications for their abandonment. Consider what happened in Warsaw 5 years later. August 1944 found the Polish Home Army launching a desperate uprising against German occupation, timing their rebellion to coincide with the approach of Soviet forces. The strategic logic was elegant. Polish resistance would drive out the Germans just as Soviet armies arrived, allowing Poland to reclaim its capital as a free nation, rather than simply exchanging one occupier for another. The mathematics of the situation seemed to favor success. German forces in Warsaw were weakened by years of partisan warfare. Soviet armies were within artillery range of the city. British and American air forces could provide supply drops to the rebels. Everything was aligned for liberation. Yet, as Polish fighters battled German forces in the rubble of Warsaw's streets, Soviet armies halted their advance and waited. For 63 days, Stalin's forces remained stationed across the Vistula River, close enough to hear the gunfire, but far enough to avoid involvement. When Polish emissaries crossed Soviet lines to request immediate assistance, they were told that military operations required careful coordination that could not be rushed. The echo of September 1939 was unmistakable. Once again, Polish forces fought desperately, while their supposed allies calculated strategic advantages. Once again, military assistance was promised but never delivered. Once again, sophisticated explanations masked simple abandonment. The British response followed an equally familiar pattern. When Polish government officials in London requested massive air support for the Warsaw Uprising, they were told that such operations would be militarily difficult and strategically premature. The Royal Air Force did mount a few token supply flights, but these were clearly designed more to assuage British consciences than to affect the battle's outcome. The mathematical precision of this calculated neglect becomes clear when we examine what happened after the uprising failed. With Polish resistance fighters dead or captured, Soviet forces suddenly discovered that military conditions favored an immediate assault on Warsaw. They captured the city in January 1945 with relative ease, installing a communist government that would rule Poland for the next 44 years. The pattern was complete. Once again, a Polish struggle for independence had been allowed to exhaust itself fighting German forces, while Allied armies waited for the outcome to suit their broader strategic objectives. Once again, Polish sacrifice had served Allied interests, while Polish independence was sacrificed on the altar of great power politics. But the reverberations extended far beyond Poland itself. Across Eastern Europe, millions of people watched these events and drew their own conclusions about the reliability of Western promises. The ecosystem of international relations was revealing its true operating principles. Small nations existed to serve the strategic needs of large ones. Moral commitments yielded to mathematical calculations, and the language of liberation could mask the reality of abandonment. The Cold War's frozen boundaries would reflect these same patterns with geological permanence. When Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin met at Yalta in February 1945 to divide post-war Europe, the principles established during Poland's destruction provided the mathematical framework for their negotiations. Eastern European nations were treated as strategic assets to be allocated between spheres of influence, not as sovereign peoples with rights to self-determination. Poland's fate at Yalta demonstrated how completely the September 1939 template had become normalized. Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to Soviet domination of Poland in exchange for Stalin's promises about democratic elections that everyone knew would never be held. The same leaders who had proclaimed the Atlantic Charter's dedication to national self-determination calmly signed agreements that guaranteed Poland's subjugation for generations. The human cost of this normalization rippled outward in waves that touched every continent. Polish refugees scattered across the globe, carrying with them the bitter knowledge that democratic principles applied selectively and that Allied victory had not meant Allied justice. Many never returned to their homeland, establishing diaspora communities that would preserve the memory of betrayal across generations. These displaced Poles became living testimony to the gap between Allied rhetoric and Allied action. In the factories of Detroit, the universities of Toronto, the sheep stations of Australia, they raised children who grew up understanding that moral absolutes were luxury items that smaller nations could not afford. Their stories became cautionary tales about the mathematics of international relations, where strategic necessity always trumped moral consistency. The pattern established in Poland influenced decolonization movements across Africa and Asia. National liberation leaders studying the historical record drew obvious conclusions. Western support for independence movements would always be conditional on Western interests. Promises of assistance would evaporate when costs exceeded benefits, and moral arguments would yield to strategic calculations with predictable regularity. The Suez Crisis of 1956 provided a perfect demonstration of how these lessons had been internalized. When Britain and France attempted to reassert control over the Suez Canal, the United States forced their withdrawal not through moral arguments about decolonization, but through economic pressure that made continuation impossible. The message was clear. Even close allies could be abandoned when their actions conflicted with American strategic priorities. Hungary's revolution that same year offered an even more precise echo of the Polish experience. Hungarian freedom fighters battled Soviet forces, while Western radio stations broadcast messages of support and encouragement. Yet when Hungarian leaders requested military assistance, they received the same sophisticated explanations about strategic complexity that had been offered to Polish commanders 17 years earlier. The mathematics of abandonment remained constant even as the specific circumstances changed. The psychological aftershock of these repeated betrayals fundamentally altered how smaller nations approached international relations. The non-aligned movement that emerged during the Cold War was, in many ways, a direct response to the lesson taught in Poland. Since great power protection was unreliable, smaller nations must find ways to survive without depending on great power promises. Even today, the seismic waves continue to propagate. When Ukrainian leaders request NATO membership, they are asking the same question that Polish leaders posed in 1939. Will Western democracies risk their own security to defend the independence of a smaller nation? The mathematical calculations remain. Unchanged alliance commitments will be honored when they serve the broader interests of alliance leaders, and reinterpreted when they threaten those interests. The aftershocks of September 1939 are not historical curiosities. They are the geological foundation of contemporary international relations. Every crisis that involves great power, calculations, and small nation survival echoes with the same fundamental tensions that destroyed Poland. Every promise of protection carries the implicit caveat that protection depends on strategic convenience. The ecosystem that emerged from Poland's destruction has proven remarkably stable and adaptable. It has survived the end of the Cold War, the rise of international human rights law, and the creation of new international institutions designed to prevent exactly the kind of great power cynicism that characterized the 30s. Yet the fundamental mathematics remain unchanged. When survival is at stake, strategic calculation trumps moral commitment with geological inevitability. The voices of those who lived through the original earthquake grow fainter with each passing year, but the aftershocks they generated continue to shape our world, reminding us that some historical traumas become permanent features of the international landscape, geological facts that influence every subsequent political formation. In the great ecosystem of international relations, Poland's destruction was not an aberration, it was a foundation event, establishing patterns that would govern great power behavior for generations to come. There are moments in the life of historical scholarship when the earth shifts beneath our feet, not in the geological sense, but in the intellectual sense that transforms everything we thought we knew about the past. December 25, 1991, was one such moment. As the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time and the USSR dissolved into constituent republics, something far more significant than political boundaries was changing. The vast archipelago of Soviet archives, sealed for 70 years behind walls of state secrecy, suddenly began to crack open. Imagine being a historian in those extraordinary months, watching as filing cabinets that had been locked since Stalin's era were finally opened to scholarly examination. It was like being an archaeologist granted access to a pyramid that had remained sealed since the pharaohs, or an astronomer discovering that previously invisible portions of the universe had suddenly become observable. Documents that researchers had spent decades speculating about were finally available for direct examination. The revelations came in waves, each more stunning than the last. Stalin's private correspondence revealed the methodical planning that had preceded the Polish invasion by months, not days. Detailed military planning documents showed that Soviet forces had been positioned for the assault on Poland long before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. Perhaps most damning of all, transcripts of Politburo meetings demonstrated that the coordination with Nazi forces had been far more extensive than even the most cynical Western observers had suspected. But the Soviet archives were only part of the story. The end of the Cold War created a cascade effect that opened previously classified documents across Europe and North America. British Foreign Office files that had been sealed under the 50-year rule suddenly became available for examination. French military archives released planning documents that had been considered too sensitive for public consumption. American diplomatic cables from the critical period were declassified in massive batches. The mathematical precision of what these documents revealed was breathtaking. Stalin had not simply seized an opportunity when it presented itself. He had been calculating the optimal moment to strike at Poland for months, before the German invasion began. Soviet intelligence reports from the spring of 1939 show detailed assessments of Polish defensive capabilities, German invasion plans, and Western response probabilities. One document in particular stops you in your tracks with its cold precision. A memorandum from Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov to Stalin, dated July 15, 1939, 6 weeks before the Nazi Pact was signed, outlines what he calls the Polish solution, with the detachment of a businessman discussing market opportunities. German forces will require approximately 3 weeks to achieve decisive superiority over Polish resistance, he writes. Optimal intervention timing would allow Polish forces to exhaust their reserves against German assault while preserving maximum territorial gains for Soviet administration. The human mind struggles to process such calculated cruelty. Molotov was discussing the death of a nation with the same analytical tone that might be used to evaluate crop yields or industrial production targets. Polish independence was not a moral question in Soviet calculations. It was a logistical problem to be solved with maximum efficiency and minimum cost. But the Soviet documents, devastating as they were, paled in comparison to what British archives revealed about Western calculations during the crisis. Cabinet minutes from September 19, 1939, just 2 days after Soviet forces invaded Poland, record discussions that read like a masterclass in moral gymnastics. Lord Halifax presents the government's position with remarkable clarity. We must distinguish between German and Soviet actions in Poland. German invasion represents unprovoked aggression requiring immediate response. Soviet intervention represents defensive positioning against German expansion requiring careful evaluation. The distinction is legally meaningless, but politically essential. It allows Britain to maintain moral authority while avoiding military obligations. Even more revealing are the private communications between British and French leadership during the critical period. A telegram from Prime Minister Chamberlain to French Premier Daladier, sent on September 22, demonstrates the sophisticated nature of Allied coordination in abandoning Poland. Soviet intervention complicates, but does not alter our strategic position. We must preserve flexibility for future alliance possibilities, while maintaining current commitments to Polish independence. This requires careful balance between moral consistency and strategic necessity. The telegram's elegant phrasing cannot disguise its brutal mathematics. Chamberlain is explicitly instructing his French counterpart to maintain the fiction of supporting Polish independence while avoiding any actions that might actually advance that goal. It is diplomatic doublespeak elevated to an art form. French military archives proved equally illuminating. General Maurice Gamelin's planning documents reveal that French forces had never seriously intended to launch a meaningful offensive against Germany during the Polish crisis. The famous Saar offensive that France claimed to be mounting involved fewer than 50,000 troops advancing less than 5 miles into German territory before halting. It was military theatre designed to create the appearance of action while avoiding the reality of combat. Gamelin's private notes are even more damning. Polish resistance serves French interests by requiring German forces to remain concentrated in the east, he writes. Premature French offensive would relieve pressure on Germany while exposing French forces to unnecessary casualties. Strategic patience serves both French and Polish long-term interests. The logic is impeccable if you ignore the fact that Poland would not survive long enough to benefit from such long-term thinking. Perhaps the most psychologically revealing documents came from the personal papers of individual decision-makers. Churchill's private diary entries from September 1939 show a man wrestling with contradictions that would challenge any moral philosopher. The Bolshevik system is as wicked as the Nazi system, he writes on September 18th. Yet strategic necessity may require temporary accommodation with wickedness in service of ultimate victory over even greater wickedness. The intellectual contortions required to maintain such positions become visible in Churchill's subsequent entries. He devotes pages to justifying Soviet actions in terms of Russian security needs while simultaneously condemning identical German actions as unprovoked aggression. The cognitive dissonance is palpable, yet Churchill manages to construct elaborate philosophical frameworks that make his position appear not just defensible but morally necessary. American diplomatic archives added another layer of complexity to the emerging picture. President Roosevelt's correspondence with Ambassador Joseph Kennedy in London reveals an administration that understood exactly what was happening, but chose to interpret events through the lens of American interests. European powers are demonstrating once again their inability to manage their own affairs, Roosevelt writes. American involvement in such calculations would serve no constructive purpose and might compromise our flexibility in dealing with eventual outcomes. The cold precision of American detachment is striking. Roosevelt was not ignorant of Polish suffering. He was choosing to prioritize American strategic positioning over European moral obligations. The decision was calculated, not callous, which somehow makes it more disturbing rather than less. But the most devastating revelations came from captured German documents that had been held in various archives since the end of World War II, but were only properly analyzed in light of the newly available Soviet materials. When German and Soviet planning documents are read together, the coordination between Nazi and Communist forces becomes impossible to ignore. A joint German-Soviet military protocol, signed on September 28, 1939, divides Poland with the precision of a surgical operation. German forces would withdraw from territories allocated to the Soviet sphere in exchange for Soviet forces withdrawing from areas designated for German administration. The document includes detailed maps, population transfer agreements, and protocols for exchanging prisoners captured by the wrong side. Reading these documents today, with the benefit of historical hindsight, you realize that Poland was not conquered by two separate invasions that happened to coincide. It was dissected by two coordinated operations that had been planned in advance with mathematical precision. The secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was not a contingency plan, but a blueprint for the systematic elimination of Polish independence. The mathematical elegance of this coordination extended to intelligence sharing between Nazi and Soviet forces. Intercepted communications show German units providing Soviet commanders with detailed information about Polish defensive positions, while Soviet forces shared intelligence about Polish troop movements with their German counterparts. The two totalitarian powers had not simply agreed to divide Poland, they had agreed to help each other conquer it. Yet, even these devastating revelations might not have changed Western calculations in 1939. Additional documents from British intelligence archives show that Western analysts suspected extensive German-Soviet coordination but chose to interpret their evidence in ways that supported predetermined policy positions. A secret intelligence assessment dated September 25, 1939, states explicitly, "Evidence suggests coordinated German-Soviet operations against Poland exceed public statements about non-aggression. However, confronting both totalitarian powers simultaneously would exceed British capacity while offering minimal probability of success in restoring Polish independence." The assessment's conclusion is mathematically sound and morally devastating. British interests are best served by maintaining flexibility regarding Soviet relations while containing German expansion through alliance with available partners, even if such partnerships require tactical accommodation with Soviet territorial gains. The archives revealed that the Great Silence following Soviet aggression was not the result of confusion or surprise. It was the product of careful calculation by democratic leaders who understood exactly what they were choosing to ignore and why. The moral compromises were not accidental but intentional, not the result of incomplete information, but the consequence of complete understanding. These documentary revelations transformed our understanding of September 1939 from a story about democratic confusion to a story about democratic calculation. The archives showed that Western leaders had not failed to understand what was happening to Poland. They had chosen to sacrifice Poland for what they believed to be larger strategic necessities. The mathematical precision of these calculations, preserved in the cold language of diplomatic cables and military assessments, demonstrates how efficiently moral considerations can be subordinated to strategic ones when survival seems to be at stake. The archives transformed speculation into certainty, suspicion into documented fact, and cynical assumptions into verified reality. History, it turns out, was even more calculated than the most cynical observers had imagined. There are questions that haunt the human imagination precisely because they cannot be answered with certainty, only explored with deepening understanding. What if the course of that fateful September had been different? What if Britain and France had treated both invasions of Poland with equal moral outrage? What if Western democracies had chosen principle over pragmatism in that crucial moment when the international system revealed its true operating principles? These questions refuse to rest because they illuminate not just what happened in 1939, but what continues to happen whenever great powers confront the gap between their stated values and their strategic necessities. The mathematics of alternate history may be speculative, but the patterns they reveal are enduringly real. Consider first the most tantalizing possibility. What if Britain and France had declared war on the Soviet Union immediately after Stalin's forces crossed into Poland? The mathematical implications cascade through decades of subsequent history, like dominoes falling in patterns we can only imagine. With Western democracies fighting both Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia simultaneously, the Second World War might have become something entirely different, a three-way global conflict pitting democratic capitalism against both fascist and communist totalitarianism. The military mathematics of such a scenario strain the imagination. Britain and France, already struggling to match German industrial capacity, would have faced the combined production capabilities of Germany and Russia working in coordination. The Battle of Britain might have involved not just German Luftwaffe formations, but Soviet aircraft operating from bases in occupied Eastern Europe. The Atlantic might have seen German U-boats coordinating with Soviet submarines in a pincer movement against British shipping. Yet there is another mathematical possibility that haunts strategic historians. Such early confrontation might have prevented the very alliance between Hitler and Stalin that made their coordination so devastating. If Western democracies had forced both dictators to choose sides immediately, rather than allowing them to maintain their cynical partnership, the totalitarian powers might have turned on each other much earlier. Stalin's private correspondence, revealed in the post-Cold War archive openings, suggests that Soviet cooperation with Nazi Germany was always tactical rather than strategic. The communist leader viewed Hitler as a temporary ally of convenience, not a permanent partner. Early Western pressure might have accelerated the timeline of German-Soviet conflict, potentially creating a situation where democratic and communist forces aligned against fascism by 1940 instead of 1941. The ripple effects of such alternative mathematics extend far beyond military calculations. A shorter war, ending with Germany crushed between Western and Soviet forces by 1941, might have left America as a nuclear power, facing a conventional Soviet Union across a liberated rather than occupied Eastern Europe. The promises dairy Cold War's fundamental dynamics, the nuclear balance of terror, the division of Germany, the subjugation of Eastern European nations might never have materialized. But perhaps the most profound alternative involves Poland itself. Early Western confrontation with Soviet aggression might have preserved Polish independence, maintaining the nation as a buffer state between German and Russian spheres of influence, rather than allowing it to be carved up between them. The millions of Poles who died during the war, the millions more who spent generations under communist rule, the cultural devastation of a nation torn between occupying powers, all of this human cost might have been avoided. Yet these tantalizing possibilities must be weighed against darker mathematical realities. A three-way global war might have lasted far longer and cost far more lives than the conflict that actually occurred. Nuclear weapons, developed in the crucible of extended warfare, might have been used not just against Japan, but against European cities locked in desperate struggle. The technological acceleration that characterized the Second World War might have produced even more devastating weapons earlier in the timeline. The questions that emerge from such speculation reveal why the Polish crisis continues to resonate across the decades. It was not simply a historical event, but a revealing moment, a test case that exposed the fundamental tensions between moral rhetoric and strategic behavior that continue to define international relations. These same tensions play out today with mathematical precision in places whose names have become synonymous with the gap between democratic ideals and democratic actions. Ukraine in 2014 faced the same essential question that confronted Poland in 1939. When Russian forces cross international borders in violation of international law, will Western democracies respond with moral consistency or strategic calculation? The parallels are not exact, but they are illuminating. Ukraine, like Poland, found itself caught between competing great power interests. Ukrainian leaders, like their Polish predecessors, discovered that Western promises of support carried implicit limitations that became explicit when the costs of intervention were calculated. The mathematical precision of democratic response patterns remained remarkably consistent across 75 years of geopolitical evolution. When Russian forces occupied Crimea and eastern Ukraine, Western democracies responded with the same carefully calibrated mixture of moral condemnation and strategic accommodation that characterized the response to Soviet aggression in 1939. Economic sanctions replaced military action. Diplomatic protests substituted for strategic confrontation. The language of support masked the mathematics of abandonment. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's speeches to Western parliaments echo with the same desperate eloquence that characterized Polish pleas for assistance in 1939. We are fighting not just for our independence, but for the principles you claim to defend, he tells audiences who applaud his courage while calculating the costs of actually defending those principles. The moral logic is unassailable. The strategic mathematics remain problematic. The ecosystem of international relations that emerged from Poland's destruction has proven remarkably resilient and adaptable. It survived the end of the Cold War, the creation of international human rights institutions, and the development of legal frameworks designed to prevent exactly the kind of great power cynicism that characterized the 1930s. Yet, the fundamental patterns persist with geological permanence. Small nations still discover that great power protection depends on great power interests. Alliance commitments still prove more flexible than alliance rhetoric suggests. International law still operates differently for different categories of nations. The mathematical relationships between moral principles and strategic necessities remain essentially unchanged. Consider the questions that keep military strategists awake in contemporary Washington, London, and Paris. If China moves against Taiwan, will Western democracies risk nuclear war to defend Taiwanese independence? If Russia escalates further in Eastern Europe, at what point do NATO obligations become strategic suicide? If authoritarian powers coordinate their expansion as Germany and Russia did in 1939, can democratic alliances maintain both moral consistency and strategic coherence? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are immediate policy challenges that require mathematical precision in their resolution. The lessons learned in Poland continue to inform the calculations of democratic leaders who must balance competing moral and strategic imperatives in an international system that rewards pragmatism more than principle. Yet there is something profoundly disturbing about the persistence of these patterns. Human civilization has developed international institutions, legal frameworks, and communication technologies that were unimaginable in 1939. We have created a global economy that makes nations interdependent in ways that should theoretically make aggression economically self-defeating. We have established human rights as universal principles that transcend national sovereignty. None of these developments has fundamentally altered the mathematics of international relations when core strategic interests are at stake. The same calculations that led democratic leaders to abandon Poland continue to influence democratic responses to contemporary crises. The same gap between rhetoric and action, between stated principles and actual behavior, continues to characterize great power politics. The questions that emerge from Poland's destruction are not historical curiosities. They are persistent features of the international landscape that continue to shape contemporary events. They remind us that moral progress in international relations may be more illusory than real, that the fundamental dynamics of power politics remain remarkably consistent across technological and institutional change. As we listen to contemporary political leaders speak about democracy, human rights, and international law, The echo of those September days in 1939 reminds us to pay attention not just to what is said, but to what is calculated, not just to moral rhetoric, but to strategic mathematics, not just to stated principles, but to revealed preferences when those principles are tested by genuine costs. The questions that never sleep are those that illuminate the persistent gap between human aspirations and human behavior, between the world we claim to want and the world we actually create when our survival seems to depend on choosing between them. Poland's destruction taught us that this gap is not a temporary failure to be corrected, but a permanent feature of human political organization to be acknowledged and understood. The questions it raised will continue to disturb our moral sleep until we develop better answers to the fundamental challenge they represent. How to create international systems that preserve both strategic flexibility and moral consistency when the two come into conflict. Until then, we are left with the mathematics of abandonment that continues to govern great power behavior and the haunting knowledge that September 1939 was not an aberration, but a template that continues to shape our world.